Well, the events in Israel and Palestine have really shaken up the entire world. And they have, these grim events have really confirmed the prognosis of Trotsky, that the creation of Israel would be, as he said, a bloody trap and a tragic mockery of the Jewish people. How prophetic those words were so long ago. The media, of course, present the events on October the 7th as like a bolt from a clear blue sky. A bunch of crazy terrorists, or human animals, as the Israeli defense minister called them, committed an act of barbaric terrorism for no real reason, just because that's what they do. And pro-Israeli politicians, who of course are basically all of the politicians in the West, they're always trying to do one thing, which is to take the conversation always back to October the 7th, when Hamas did what it did. They want that to be the context in which everything is seen in order to justify everything that Israel is doing now. Although such is the brutality of Israel's response that even that doesn't work, because clearly Israel has gone far beyond what Hamas did. This is a textbook example of why we do not base ourselves as Marxists on who fired the first shot in order to determine who is responsible. And it's almost always the case that, I mean, when do you draw the line? Who really fired the first shot, right? Was that really the first shot? You know, when Hamas swept over the border, was that the first? That just came out of nowhere, did it? For us, instead, it's obviously a class question, and it's a question of who is fighting for what, who represents what interests, who is oppressing whom, and with what methods. The hypocrisy of our pro-Israeli politicians is absolutely sickening, because they always say this: Israel has the right to defend itself. They never say why they think that Palestinians don't have the right to resist. Because, of course, that would open up the question of resistance. Well, if they're resisting, then there must be something that they are resisting, right? So what happened before October the 7th? What is the real context to all of this? That is a question we're not really supposed to ask. We're always just told, it's very complicated. It's very complicated, it's messy. You'll have that in conversations with people all the time. You speak to a lot of people, you know, maybe they're not that political. They say, it's very complicated, isn't it? And what that's trying to generate is this impression that all of this bloodshed here, it's really just a result of complex history of mutual hatred on both sides, you know, of a cycle of violence, and no one really even knows what started it anymore. It's just that depressing human tendency to hating other people. As if the reality is just two different countries, two different states, relatively equal, side by side, and they just, you know, for racist reasons, for prejudice reasons, they don't like each other, and occasionally they have bouts of violence. I mean, of course, it's a truism. Of course, the reality is complicated. Any major political conflict in history is always complex. It's very banal to point that out. But the main cause of the violence is not particularly hard to understand, and it's not a secret. The creation of Israel was an act of ethnic cleansing and colonization, serving the interests of and carried out with the aid of American and particularly British imperialism at the time. That's the main point, that not what Israel is doing now, as bad as it is, but daily life for 75 years for Palestinian people means living in a refugee camp and having no resources. It's enough to just point out to most Europeans, you know, imagine, take a picture of, you know, the map of your country. Imagine if that's your country, and then suddenly you're reduced to this tiny pocket of it by some other people. How do you think that British people or French people or German people or Swiss people would react to that? But this, of course, is almost never discussed on mainstream news programs and the like. The real starting point is that we should begin with is the Sykes-Picot Act of 1916, an agreement between the British and the French that was a colossal act of imperialist meddling and betrayal. which has defined the Middle East and all of its problems ever since. And we sometimes say that American imperialism, of course, by extension, British imperialism, is the most reactionary force on earth. And I'm sure some people think that sounds a bit over the top, but it's enough to point out these basic facts which define our world to show why that is the case. Now, so what happened is that the British, in particular, had promised the Arabs their freedom from Ottoman domination if they supported France and Britain in World War I. And that was never the intention. It was just a barefaced lie. So after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the region was carved up in an arbitrary fashion, and France and Britain were given control over different areas. And Palestine was given to the British. Now, alongside the British control of Palestine and preceding it, in fact, had been the development of Zionism, which really started in the late 19th century, in response to the pogroms that were growing increasingly common in Europe. There had, I believe, always been a small Jewish population in the area, i.e. in sort of in the Levant, in Palestine, basically. But that started gradually increasing because of the ideology of Zionism. In other words, the idea that, well, we should go and settle in that area. But the ideology of Zionism is, of course, a bourgeois nationalist ideology. And so for it, the key question, the key division in society is not class, or anything else, but is the national division. So it saw the key, it saw the dividing along national lines, segregation almost, if you like, as being the key to the freedom for the key to freedom for Jewish people. So to end the terrible oppression of Jewish people, rather than trying to integrate or to unite with their class brothers and sisters, which of course as bourgeois nationalists they didn't believe in the working class, so of course they wouldn't see it that way. Rather, to end their oppression, they must separate off from everybody else and find their own nation states, which means, of course, also uniting Jewish people of different class backgrounds. Hence, this gradual process of colonization, starting in the late 19th century, took a sectarian form. It wasn't really characterized by Jewish people immigrating and kind of integrating into the local population, but by the buying up of land, often by tricking poor Arab farmers out of the land that they rented. As a result, land prices increased by about 50 times from 1910 to 1944. I'm sure there are many exceptions, but in many cases, the Jewish settlers didn't learn the local language, the Arabic. They in fact revived Hebrew as a language. And there was a constant sectarian battling over jobs and resources. There was the emergence of a trade union movement because there was, under the British control, there was the beginning of industrialization. And the Jewish workers, would work side by side with Arab workers, and so instinctively went for unity, and they would sometimes form trade unions together and conduct strike activity together. But Zionist trade unions were formed under the leadership and control of the Zionist movement, and they constantly worked against this. And in fact, they worked not only to exclude Arabs from the trade unions, but to exclude the jobs from Arabs, or to give Arabs different jobs, rather. And so, as you can imagine, this led to growing sectarian violence well before the creation of Israel as a state. And all of this happened under British control. In fact, for most of the period of 1918 to 1948, the British saw Zionism as a useful tool for their interests in the Middle East. They thought that if they facilitated this immigration, the Jewish people there would be grateful for them and they could manipulate them in British interests. Nevertheless, it has to be said, most Jewish people in Europe were not particularly interested in this process. Far more of them, when they wanted to flee Europe because of the pogroms, far more of them went to the United States, and more still, and a few more also went to Britain. Far more then went to Israel. Generally, they didn't want segregation, and they didn't particularly want their own nation state cut, separated from all the other states. But of course, World War II and the Holocaust happened, which changed that quite profoundly. And once the Nazis were in power, that did give a boost to this Zionist idea. Immigration to Israel increased, although it's still more Jews were going to America than Israel, but it did increase. The numbers going to Israel did increase. And so it was enough for the Jewish people in Palestine to create a kind of para-state, if you like, with their own military and police force. And they accumulated funds to facilitate the buying up of land by individual Jewish people. And by 1948, they were strong enough to push for the creation of a nation state, especially because the British Empire was collapsing and it was no longer really possible for Britain to maintain control. And so, Israel was declared a state with the backing of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. But it's very important to point out that the initial plan that was sponsored or approved by the UN was very different to what we have today. Because the plan was actually for there to be two states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, with roughly equal populations. But of course, that didn't happen because as soon as this was declared, the Zionists went on a rampage, which was a deliberate attempt to make this plan, which was, in their eyes, not favorable to them, to make it unviable. There was a massive campaign of terror. So, by the way, they talk every time, for example, Hamas is mentioned on British television, they have to say, and Hamas is a terrorist organization, by the way. It's like this magic word that completely invalidates anything and makes the other side, acceptable. But many of the founders of Israel and future prime ministers were literal terrorists in the sort of, not in the sense of state terrorists, but actual, terrorists like you have today in Hamas and things like that. Yeah, and they drove people out of villages, massacred whole villages of Palestinians in many cases. Upon driving people off the land, they would bulldoze the houses in order to make sure that those people could never had anything to come back to. And in the end, 750,000 Palestinians were made refugees, and they remain so today. The children of those people, they still live in these refugee camps that are throughout the region. They were creating what they call euphemistically facts on the ground, taking action that basically meant that, okay, well, this plan for a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state is just not possible because the people aren't there. This was called the Nakba, as you probably know, by the Palestinians, which means the catastrophe. And this is vital to understand because, as we always say, war is the continuation of politics by other means. As I said before, they're always trying to frame everything as just about this conflict. But the point isn't that the very existence of Israel is in the way as the capitalist imperialist state that it is means, the colonization. It means the brutal oppression of Palestinian people day in, day out. But it's also very important because it tells you what you need to know about the two-state solution, which laughably I see that Biden is once again trying to promote. That was the original idea of the UN way back in 1947. And it was far more workable then than it is today. Because, at the time, there were many Palestinians living in and throughout that region, that area. But it was intolerable to Zionism at the time. The key point is that the Zionists were more powerful. They were better organized. They were wealthier. They had better, they had a more powerful military forces, and therefore they were able to impose their solution onto the Palestinians. And so on a capitalist basis, in that context, a two-state position then was not possible. To imagine that it's possible now with a nuclear-armed Israel backed with $3.3 billion of annual military aid from the United States is ridiculous. The Israeli ruling class depends in every way upon the current situation, on the domination of resources and infrastructure that they have. They depend on the cheap labor of Palestinian refugees, which they can exploit enormously. And ideologically, they depend upon the idea of a powerful Israel, which they have to sell to the Jewish population there as a justification for Israeli capitalism, which of course also exploits the Jewish working class. There's absolutely no way that without disturbing or overthrowing capitalism, without a mass revolutionary movement, there's no way that a two-state solution in this capitalist world that we live in is going to come into being. And this is underlined by the whole subsequent history of Israel, which is a series of one-sided wars against the Palestinians and neighboring Arab countries such as Lebanon and Syria. And the routine bombing of Gaza, which takes place, intermittently every few years, as it obviously is right now. By the way, this military brutality that we see also shows the why we shouldn't raise the pacifistic demand of a ceasefire. It's abstract and moralistic. When we raise demands, we have to say, well, who is to carry out this demand? Who is the demand directed at? And how is the demand going to be fulfilled? I suppose the idea is that moral pressure is going to lead Israel to just stopping, as if vague moral opinion is more important than the pressures within Israeli society. It is possible that eventually that there will be, well, eventually, of course, it will stop fighting, but it's conceivable there would be a ceasefire. Probably more likely because of unacceptable losses of Israeli soldiers rather than public opinion in the rest of the world. But in such a situation, what next? What's next? What would that mean that then Israel not only calls a ceasefire, but magnanimously decides to rebuild Gaza and even allow some of the Palestinians back into the land that they originally saw? Clearly not. And just calling for a ceasefire says nothing about that. Calling for a ceasefire is like looking at all the horrors and the inequality of capitalist society and inscribing on your banner, everyone should just be nicer to each other. Or like, stop greed, or something like that. Probably some people would praise you for doing that and thinking it's a very a very humanitarian thing to say. But obviously it's worse than useless because it confuses people. Does this mean that the situation is hopeless? Because it does sound rather bleak. Not at all. Because imperialist powers always have feet of clay. They only appear invincible because the masses that they oppress and exploit are so often disorganized and relatively passive, or have confused leaderships. But brutal oppression of a people always gives rise to mass resistance and to revolutionary movements of the oppressed. And this is the other side of the history of Israel-Palestine. In the 1960s, after 20 or so years of occupation, and crushing military defeats of the Arab regimes that briefly fought Israel, a mass movement of resistance did emerge in all of those refugee camps that you had. In particular, that was what led to the creation of Fatah and also the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is hardly surprising if you imagine the condition and the consciousness in these camps that eventually such an organization would appear in such densely populated refugee camps. These organizations very quickly grew to have enormous mass followings, and they had huge potential. As we know from recent history, even the most powerful military in the world cannot control and occupy a people who are standing up and determined to fight it and are getting organized. And in fact, these organizations became so popular and powerful that they became a source of instability for the surrounding Arab regimes as well. Many of these refugee camps were hosted by countries like Jordan and Lebanon. The regimes used them actually as cheap labor. But as you can imagine, the Arab people of those countries were hugely sympathetic to the Palestinians, and of course were themselves oppressed and exploited by their own ruling classes. So the appearance of a militant organizations of national liberation within their own countries, you can imagine that was very dangerous for these regimes as well. It meant there was the real potential for an international revolutionary movement within within the whole Arab region, really, that could topple regime after regime. And that would be a serious threat to the Israeli state. However, unfortunately, these organizations were undermined by weak leadership, to say the least. They were heavily influenced by Stalinism and Arab nationalism, and their method was to avoid mobilizing their mass support base. They believed in the two-stage theory, that we need democratic rights first, and then we can talk about a mass struggle for socialism later. Influenced by Stalinism, they believed in also diplomatic negotiations at the top, in bureaucratic methods, basically. At best, they hoped to use the threat of mass mobilization and mass support to get a stronger hand in the negotiations. But they never really believed in the possibility of a mass uprising throughout the Middle East that could topple regime after regime. In fact, they had illusions in the Arab regimes in the region because they were Arab nationalists. They thought that those regimes might back their struggle against Israel, but unfortunately, tragically, those Arab regimes, they always betrayed the Palestinians for the main reason I said, because they were terrified of the potential of that movement to topple their own power at base as well. So they never really wanted to encourage any fighting. So the whole struggle was seen on a national basis and not a class basis. And of course, if it were to come down to a national armed struggle of Arabs versus Israelis, it would never work, because the Israeli state was backed by the United States. It was far more powerful. Its military, it ended up becoming a nuclear power, as I've said. This is proven by its consistent victories in the brief wars that it did fight with Egypt and other countries. And in fact, it wasn't even a struggle of Arabs versus Israelis, because, as I said, the Arab regimes never seriously wanted to fight anyway. So it was really a fight of desperately oppressed and poor Palestinians versus the Israeli state. Seen in that way, in other words, an armed struggle without a mass class-based movement, it's always a cruel joke, really. There's the idea of a few rockets being fired into Israel it's not a threat to the Israeli state. But the potential and the need for a mass and a class-based struggle, not a national one or a terroristic one, was shown by the First Intifada, which happened in spite of the leaders of the Palestinians. This was a spontaneous movement from below. And it was an earth-shattering, inspiring, revolutionary movement, which has been largely written out of the history books. When we've been being told in many countries that the slogan Intifada till victory is what you're advocating is racial violence against Jewish people. Now, that is partly because subsequent intifadas did have more of a terrorist component to them. So we have to point that out, that is not what we're referring to. But the First Intifada was a huge event. It lasted for years, which tells you what? That the Israeli state could not suppress it. And what you had was just thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians organizing themselves, not just with mass demonstrations and stone throwing by kids at the Israeli soldiers, as heroic as it is for children to do that. But you had a general strike at one point. You had the establishment of, I believe, 45,000 committees to organize the struggle, to distribute food, etc. The Israeli state responded in its usual way, which was with barbaric violence. Yitzhak Rabin, who is remembered as some sort of moderate martyr because he led the Oslo Accords and was then assassinated for that. He was a general at the time, and he actually ordered his soldiers to break the arms and legs of the Palestinian children throwing stones. But as always, when such a movement develops, in other words, a revolutionary movement, repressive measures like that, they don't work. In fact, they only spur it on. And the combination of, on the one hand, this disgusting repression, and on the other hand, this powerful movement that was genuinely shaking and challenging the Israeli state, but not necessarily threatening individual Israelis. That's the thing about the sort of the terrorism of Hamas, is that it's almost designed to be as counterproductive as possible, because it does genuinely threaten Israelis. They do feel they've got to sort of huddle under their state for support or for protection. But on the other hand, it's obviously far too weak to actually pose a serious challenge to the Israeli state. So it teaches the Israelis that their state is a very powerful and effective way of defending themselves. Although, admittedly, with the October 7th events did slightly puncture that because they were so significant. But this was not the case with the first Intifada. It was not possible to control it and suppress it. And it was not threatening daily life of Israelis. And so as a result, you had some soldiers, I think, mutinying. You had widespread questioning of what Israel was doing in Israeli society. They saw the violence of their own military, and that violence didn't seem to be protecting them from anything. It just seemed to be oppressing people who were very well organized. Hence the fact that Yitzhak Rabin had a kind of 180-degree turn, and as a result, he said the following. He said, "I've learned something in the past 2.5 months. Among other things, that you can't rule by force over 1.5 million Palestinians." So how did they resolve this problem? As usual with movements like this, they diverted it with sort of legalistic promises. So you had the Oslo Accords of the early 90s, which established the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be the foundation, the first step on the creation of a Palestinian state. And I think probably at the time, a certain number of Palestinians would have gone along with that. They would have thought, it's worked, but this is the way forwards. Of course, all it was a way of diverting a threatening revolutionary movement into a safe channel, which is proven by the entire subsequent 30-year history, which has seen more and more settlers taking land in the West Bank, and the Palestinian Authority has been revealed as just a sort of an office boy doing Israel's work for it. The dream of a Palestinian state is further away than ever. And in the decades since then, both Israeli and Palestinian politics have changed quite a lot. The betrayal of Fatah as it runs the Palestinian Authority has massively discredited it, which led to Hamas's taking over winning control in Gaza in, I think, 2006. Which, of course, it represents a radicalization of things in Palestinian politics, but obviously not in a direction which is progressive. And in the Palestinian Authority, Fatah still rules the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but that's been done without any elections for decades. I can't remember when the last one was, but it's at least 15 years ago. And of course, Israeli politics has changed in much the same way, really, that politics in most Western countries has changed. So-called Labour Zionism has completely gone. Israel has become more what you could call neoliberal capitalism. Obviously, that's not a phrase that we really use because it creates the impression that you can have nicer capitalism. What it really means is the reversion to the norm of capitalism, which is massive inequality. And it's easier for them to do that thanks to the existence of Hamas, because they can constantly sell to the Israeli population that the surrounding people all want you dead. They can whip up this nationalist hysteria and use that as a smokescreen for carrying out austerity policies, essentially, and to hide the fact that there are no parties that are offering any solutions to the problems of working class Israelis. So Israel has become one of the most unequal advanced capitalist countries in the world. And they've kind of created a bit of a Frankenstein's monster with these settler colonial fanatics, with a complete absence of a left wing in Israeli politics. And as that's resulted in the crisis that Israeli politics was in just before the current situation, where Netanyahu was ruling in coalition with these far-right politicians. And actually, I think that's a big cause of the current situation, because there was a massive increase in provocations and in the building of settlements and raids on refugee camps and things like that. They basically have driven the Palestinians to a point of extreme despair. And they also, actually, it's quite well known, really, that particularly Netanyahu, but the Israeli state has actually sponsored and helped the rise of Hamas, because they, it's much the same, really, as the promotion of Islamic fundamentalism or Islamism by the United States. They saw it initially as a useful counterweight to the left-wing tendencies within the Palestinian population. And then as it developed, they saw it as a kind of useful, bogeyman to terrify the Israeli population with. But as with Islamism throughout the world, it's become a Frankenstein's monster that they can't control. So they've created two Frankenstein's monsters, the far right of Israeli politics and Hamas. Anyway, the question also we have to ask is, of course, what next? I've already criticized these demands, like for a ceasefire, for a two-state solution. And people have said, and they've actually asked Netanyahu, well, let's say you go in and you destroy Hamas, then what? He just says, we haven't thought that far, really. It's just obviously an indictment of them and the whole situation. And calling for a ceasefire is also ridiculous, because he says that we're not going to have a ceasefire. And America says, no, it's not time for ceasefire. Of course, also, if they did have a ceasefire, as well as the fact that the situation the status quo was intolerable anyway, if they did have a ceasefire, obviously Hamas would be enormously strengthened. It would have been seen as having successfully resisted and humiliated the Israeli state. And they've said recently, we'll do it again and again and again and again. Will do what we did on October the 7th again. So that's not a solution at all. And then there's the idea that, well, maybe they can destroy Hamas and re-establish the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. That will go down really well amongst the Gazans. And everybody knows, what they're doing. It's so stupid, that the logic of it is, we'll destroy them. Well, first of all, I don't think they can. If they did manage to destroy Hamas, the idea that there wouldn't be anything else that came to replace it, that there wouldn't be a further radicalization, is ridiculous. By the way, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is in crisis. It's been hated for a very long time. You've recently had the creation of new militant groups there, one called the Lion's Den, and there's another one, I forget the name. I'm not exactly sure of what their politics are, but they're a sort of militant armed groups. The Palestinian Authority also can't pay its staff now. Israel has just cut because Israel just pays for it all, keeping them on a leash, obviously, and they've just cut the amount of money they give them by 50%, I think, 50. And so all of these, the public sector, which is the only real source of income in the area, is just about to collapse. And you can easily imagine a revolutionary uprising or the taking of power, a coup by one of these militant groups within the West Bank. That would hardly bring more security for Israel. So the only way forward is for the only way forward, and it's not a utopian demand at all, is for the Palestinian masses and the Arab masses of the region to rise up on a class basis. Don't forget that many of the Arab regimes have recently been signing deals with Israel, establishing formal relations. Saudi Arabia was on the verge of doing so. That's obviously been put on the back burner for a while. And these regimes are absolutely despised by their people. Only just over 10 years ago, we had the Arab Spring, which showed the vast well of discontent and how that can just spread like that throughout the whole region. And this situation is massively destabilizing things everywhere, and it's entirely conceivable that you would see such a movement on a higher level at any moment. But of course, we have to say that this has to have a socialist program. With the lack of any real program in the Arab Spring, of course, led to its complete defeat. It just fizzled out, basically. And on the question of Israel-Palestine, there is no solution to it on a capitalist basis whatsoever. Just take the question of the right of return. That is the right of the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, to return. That's a key demand. We've always supported that. That's obviously a correct demand. But there's now 6 million, I think, of those refugees, the children, the children of the original people. And their original homes have long since been destroyed, and it would be nowhere near enough anyway. So how on earth are you going to have all of those people going back into Israel and housing them on a capitalist basis when you can't? By the way, there's an acute housing shortage in Israel. Only just over 10 years ago, there was a mass movement because of the housing shortage in Israel. So just on a kind of technical material basis, let alone the sectarian hatred that exists, the idea that you can resolve this problem on without touching the property relations in the region is ridiculous. Clearly a massive program of house building would be necessary. And as I've said, it is not going to be possible to militarily defeat capitalist Israel by other regimes or by the Palestinians just taking up arms and fighting it. There's nothing progressive about driving out and exiling millions of Jewish people within Israel either. Not that it would be possible. But a class-based approach is obviously completely different. That movement you had in Israel just over 10 years ago for more housing, it drew in Arab workers within Israel as well, because they said, look, we also need housing. We've got common interests. I remember it clearly. I remember there was a meeting that the leaders of that movement had with Arab people that live within Israel, and they agreed to fight together. But the movement fizzled out like so many do, of course. The prospect of a mass class-based movement for socialist demands is far less utopian than the idea of somehow militarily defeating Israel and wiping it off the map. And of course, it's also far less utopian than the idea of establishing two capitalist states side by side, like somehow depriving the Israeli state of masses of land and resources that it currently controls. We have to say, as Marxists, we have to tell the truth. We have to be honest. That's what it is to be a Marxist. It's to tell the truth even when it appears to be difficult to do so. And I think such is the mood, the radicalized mood in the world. It's not such a difficult truth to say. The only way to achieve peace and, if you like, harmony in the region is on a socialist basis, and it's by ending capitalism, by overthrowing all of these capitalist regimes.